calls them different than this man. So I'm inclined to think that Jesus looks at these marriages and says, they are marriages. They shouldn't have happened, but they happened, and therefore they're there. They're real. They're valid. Here's the third reason I think couples who remarried when they shouldn't have should stay together. Vows, even when they are made unwisely, generally should be kept in the Bible. When you make a promise that you shouldn't have made, you should keep it. Psalm 15:4, the godly man swears to his own hurt and does not change. In other words, he makes an oath and it turns out really bad and he keeps his oath. Do you remember the story of the Gibeonites? Joshua makes a vow rashly without consulting the Lord not to wipe them out, and they were lying through their teeth that they were people from a far country when they were in fact close neighbors and should have been wiped out according to the decree of God. And once that truth was discovered, Joshua kept his vow. So there are stories like that in the Bible, and they incline me to think God puts a very high premium on promises and vows and oaths and covenants, even when they should not have been made. And therefore, for those three reasons, I will never go to a couple who's on their second or third or fourth marriage and say, it was adulterous of you to move into this, and every night you sleep together, you're committing adultery, and you need to break this marriage and split up. I don't think that's the case. I think it's adulterous to move into it. You break the law of God. But once it's there and new vows have been made, a new marriage is created, and now the great business of life is to sanctify that marriage, purify that marriage. Make that marriage as radically Christ-centered as it can possibly be, and it can be. There are marriages in this church that are second marriages for both partners or for one partner, which in my view should not have come into being. It was sin to make the decision to leave and then cleave to a new couple. And today are among the most godly marriages in this church. Beautiful, deep, wise, holy, loving, Christ-like people keeping covenant that should never have come into being, but now I believe is washed, cleansed, and they should be there, magnifying God in that relationship as forgiven, justified husbands and forgiven, justified wives, followers of Jesus, not committing adultery now in their marriages. It began as it should not have, but it has become holy. So that's my answer to the second question. If you're in that situation, my view is you should stay there and devote your lives to purity and holiness from this day forward, and show by this marriage, though it was not the ideal, by this marriage, Jesus keeps covenant. Third question. If an unbelieving spouse insists on leaving a believing spouse, what should the believing spouse do? Now I invite you to turn with me to the very important passage, 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 16. If an unbelieving spouse insists on leaving, in other words, sues for divorce, what should the believing spouse do? It could be a man, could be a woman. We have instances of both in this church. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 to 16 addresses this issue. and has an ambiguous statement in it, at least some consider it ambiguous, that I'll try to interpret for you. To the rest I say, verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. I think that little phrase, won't preach on this, but I think that means I don't have a specific command from the historical teachings of Jesus, but I am led by the Spirit. To the rest I say that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Now, just pause there. This is addressed to a real situation. I mean, these early Christians took devotion to Christ very seriously. To have sex with an enemy of the cross did not seem right. Does it seem right to you? We need this text. It ought to feel, to be married to an enemy of the cross. And I'm using that phrase from Philippians carefully. This is not an exorbitant person. This is an ordinary unbeliever. Doesn't think he's an enemy of the cross. He's a nice guy. Or she's a nice woman. But in stiff-arming the King of Kings, they're committing treason. So do you have sex with such a person? So it was a real issue. And here's Paul's answer. Stay together. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy by his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Which I take to mean this. Marriage is such a holy union in God's eyes that a believer, a child of God, is not defiled by having sexual relations with an enemy of the cross. And the children born in this union of a child of God and an enemy of God, the child born does not have any special contamination because of that. That's what I think holy means here. I don't think it means they're saved. Rather, born or married, in this situation, you can be set apart for proper holy use in the marriage. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, sued for divorce, took off. Let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So the answer to this question is, if an unbeliever departs and insists that the marriage be done, goes to court, sues, Paul says, you're called to peace. Let him go. You're not enslaved. Now, what does that mean? Okay, here's the ambiguity. Is the person not enslaved to the marriage, and Paul permits them to end it? Or is the person not enslaved to the consequent singleness so that they're free to remarry? Those are the two questions. And I think the former, and others think this text is a permission. Is not enslaved means free to remarry. And there are 4 reasons I'll give you why I think that's a mistake to say that this is a permission for remarriage after that happens. The first is that Paul is a single man who we saw loves his singleness. and speaks in glowing terms about the